Greetings and welcome to our conversation, our daily walk through the Bible, if you will, for May the 15th. Today, our readings find us in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5 through 30, and all of 1 Samuel 19. And then we see John chapter 8, verses 31 through 59, Psalm 112, and Proverbs chapter 15, verses 12 through 14. Now, interestingly enough, there is a phrase, a teaching that Jesus says in John chapter 8 that I think works really well with our conversation with Saul. And that's actually found in verse 31 of our reading in John 8 today, when Jesus says, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, the reason why I bring this up is because if you look at Samuel, you notice that he is a man who is trapped. He's trapped by his own devices. He's trapped by his own attitudes and his own choices. And God has abandoned him as a result of that. And so rather than being someone who is ruling in triumph, who's ruling in victory, who's ruling in confidence of God, Saul has become a man who is now ruling by fear. He's living by fear. He's living in fear. He's living in bitterness, distrust, anger, all of these different things. And as a result of that, we see a man who now begins to grow a distrust with David, whom he doesn't know it yet, but God is already preparing to replace Saul as king. And so we see this happen in several different areas. First of all, we see some jealousy happening. Now remember, this is right after David has defeated Goliath. David is now beginning to establish this beautiful friendship with Jonathan, and he's now given him a high rank in the army as a result of his successes against the Philistines and Samson in particular. Wrong guy. Goliath in particular. And when you look at this, the people start rejoicing because of the success that David has, and Saul doesn't like it. Even though David is subject to Saul, Saul sees when they talk about Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s, he takes that as a shot against him. And so he begins to really try to do things to have David killed. First of all, he tries to do it himself, by the evil spirit and pinning David to the wall. And then he tries to do it by convincing David to go and kill Philistines and get their foreskins, which is, for the record, gentlemen, if you're thinking about a dowry for a wife, that's a bad one. Just for the record, don't do that. That's pretty gross. But we see this time and time again that Saul now tries to kill him as a result. And David, for whatever reason, David continues to remain loyal to Saul. And I think ultimately it comes down to that David loves God. And because God has placed Saul in this position of leadership, therefore David is going to honor what God has done. And David trusts that God is going to take care of Saul when the timing is right. So David escapes. David does some of that. And once again, Saul continues to make some choices and tries to kill David yet again. So David finally flees. And this begins a life of running for David, if you will. And it is one of those things that that really is going to mark the end of David's career with Saul. And it's also going to kind of dictate, if you will, David and Jonathan's relationship. It's going to seal that as we look at tomorrow. It's going to do all of these different things. But we have a man in David who very much contrasts Saul. You see, Saul is someone who lives in fear. David is really, by the accounts that we see, fairly fearless. I mean, he slays a giant. He goes and he kills 200 Philistines for a dowry, still the grossest dowry ever. He continues to return back to Saul, even though Saul tries to kill him. David is a man who does not live in fear. He trusts that God is going to do it. And this is a huge contrast to how Saul has now lived. And his fear, we've gone Yoda here. Fear leads to anger, anger and jealousy. Jealousy leads to bitterness. We kind of got this whole thing happening here. So, as you read through the tragic story of Saul and Jonathan and then David, look at this and think about it. Go back to the verse that we looked at. If you are my disciple, you will not live in fear. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. When we have our lives focused on Christ and following Christ, we no longer have to worry about living in fear of choices. Do we get anxious at times? Yeah, we do, but we don't let those anxious thoughts cloud our judgment. We don't live in those thoughts. Instead, we press on, continuing towards the prize, as Paul says. Okay, there's your thought for today. We'll talk more tomorrow.